Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video, after the furore of Boris Johnson's resignation honours list, I like to discuss the one that some fool has allowed Liz Truss to compile. The leadership contest last year used to appoint her took longer than she spent in office, yet she is still being allowed a resignation honours list to reward those who destroyed our country. And bear in mind, even some long-serving prime ministers have not issued a resignation honours list. So it's not like saying, oh, everyone does it. No, they don't. No, they don't. They're just allowed to. Mind you, it does seem that at least a couple of people have turned them down out of sheer embarrassment. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So the latest incarnation of the Conservative Party have at least made many of us look at our political system and ask if maybe we shouldn't rethink a few things. One of those things is not even just resignation honours, but politically appointed honours of any kind. The House of Lords already has way more members than the House of Commons. This is totally unnecessary because its job is just supposed to be to scrutinise government legislation with a more careful eye. Remember, it's already faced some scrutiny from the elected chamber. Now it's just going to get a bit of more expert scrutiny. It's supposed to be a modest chamber with business leaders, trade unionists, former MPs, top lawyers, people who have the skills and experience to read and scrutinise legislation. There's no value in putting into that chamber someone without that background. Particularly when it's cronies of a particularly destructive prime minister. And the situation is set to get worse before it gets better. Out of sheer necessity, Keir Starmer's already said that he's going to have to pack the Lords out with Labour peers when he becomes prime minister. I mean, never mind standing room only. I mean, for goodness sake, it's only so large. At least in his case, it'll be people with a background in understanding legislation. But it will still mean an excessively bloated chamber when it is already now larger than the House of Commons. I mean, the sooner it's abolished now, the better, because there's no other way around it. And that is from someone who was not opposed to the unelected nature of the chamber for most of my life. After all, you don't need to be elected to simply scrutinise. People talk about democracy. Oh, we should elect these, we should elect these, we should... No, most jobs don't need electing. We elect legislators. Nothing else really needs electing. You don't need to be elected to just scrutinise. You just need the skills. But the chamber is not full of people with those skills anymore. And as the members have a seat for life, there is absolutely no way of reforming it. But before Starmer gets to fill it up again, Liz Truss is having a crack. She is famously being allowed a resignation honours list, which means one person will get an honour for every 4 days she was in office. Now, apparently 2 people have turned those honours down. I'm not entirely sure who. But according to the Times today, one of them is supposed to have said it would be humiliating to receive an honour from Truss. And the others simply said they don't deserve it. Which is remarkable. However, that still leaves 14 people being honoured, several of whom were instrumental in dismantling the future of the UK. If it survives into the next generation, it'll be no thanks to them. Matthew Elliott is one of the ones heading to the House of Lords. Now, here's a political strategist who has been behind a number of shady think tanks, such most famously the Taxpayers Alliance, which is a bit of a laugh because its members do everything they can to avoid taxes. These groups were designed to persuade the Conservatives to dismantle our national infrastructure. He also ran the Vote Leave campaign. Now, a lot of the attention was on Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings because they were the egomaniacs of the outfit. They did a lot of stuff in public. Elliott behind the scenes, but he was very much the brains behind it. He was also instrumental in setting up the Conservative Friends of Russia, a group which allowed Putin's network to link up with our government and poison our political system. A group which had to be disbanded hastily after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine last year, but the damage was already done. And now he's going to be a legislator for life. Less egregious, I suppose, than an actual Russian oligarch sitting in the House of Lords, certainly, but his inclusion will again shine a spotlight on the reason for being in the House of Lords. Another's Mark Littlewood, the head of the IEA, the Institute for Economic Affairs. This is the shady group behind Kwarteng's unfunded budget statement, who have members who keep appearing on, particularly the BBC are very bad at this. They'll keep presenting people from the IEA as independent economists. No, they're not. They're not economists and they're not independent. This is the group that as I say, who trained Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng up, who persuaded them to go with the mini budget. They are the ones behind the mini budget, the one that blew a hole the size of Truss's ego into our finances. Although it did at least expose the weakness of Brexit in many people's minds as well. So a major figure behind Brexit and another behind the mini budget. Truss is making peers of people who are not merely unsuitable, but who have caused irreversible damage to our country, who've plunged goodness knows how many people into poverty, who may actually, indirectly, have killed people even. The hardships created by Brexit and that mini-budget cost lives. And it just re-sparks the debate about the suitability of the House of Lords in its current form for me. There are, of course, members of the House of Commons whom I think are objectionable. Not because of their political beliefs. There are lots of MPs in the Commons with very different political beliefs to me. I don't resent their inclusion. In fact, I support a much more representative House of Commons election system. That would mean a chamber where almost everyone has different political views to me, but at least in tune with the public. And then if a representative parliament does something stupid, well, at least it's the public's fault. But there are some members who actively cheat the public. They're not worthy. That being said, they are technically democratically elected, and as a result, if the public ever get wise to them, they can be voted out. The trick is to draw attention to their shenanigans and let the public deal with them. But it doesn't matter how outraged the public are at a member of the House of Lords. They retain their seat until they either give it up themselves or are carried out in a box. In theory, there are conditions under which they can be expelled, but they'd have to be spectacularly stupid to fall foul of them. Matthew Elliott and Mark Littlewood are not spectacularly stupid, quite the reverse in fact. And that's where the House of Lords fails. Yes, if they're just scrutinising legislation, there's no need to be elected. This is why I was never opposed to the unelected nature of them for decades. But they can block legislation. They can certainly delay it for a considerable period of time. Now, if they're delaying legislation which has no public mandate, remember, it's all right saying the House of Commons is elected, but they're supposed to be elected, or the government side is supposed to be elected on their manifesto. Now, if they present something to Parliament which wasn't in the manifesto, or more specifically contradicts the manifesto, the House of Lords absolutely should make sure that there's some friction there. But if they decide to just block it for political reasons, there is absolutely nothing any member of the public, individually or collectively, can do about it. And really, it's because people with no respect for Parliament have been made members. Like, if you take royal assent, there's a little example, parallel example. So for a bill to become law, the king has to sign it into law. He always will. Like, sometimes people say, oh, well, maybe the king shouldn't sign it into law because it's disgraceful. No, he always will. In theory, he could refuse, of course. He could say, well, I don't like pens. Sorry, my fingers are struggling today. Can't sign it, I'm sorry. But he would never do that, because the second he does that, the monarchy would be over. It works as a purely constitutional arrangement. The same is true of the Lords. It is their job to look at legislation from the elected chamber and say, I don't think this does what you think it does, you know. They point out unintended consequences of the bill and suggest improvements which will do what the MPs intend, without the collateral damage caused by the ham-fisted minister who prepared the original bill. As soon as they have a material impact on the passage of legislation which does do what the House of Commons wants it to do, then we cease to be a democracy, because they're not elected. I've said before that there is good reason to restrict legislation which contradicts the winning manifesto. I've just said that, because there's no public mandate for it. But the sort of people who've been entering the Lords in recent times are the sort of people who've been entering the laws specifically to frustrate legislation which will have that mandate. Not improve it, they will seek to block it. On a personal level, it also raises their stature. If you're in the House of Lords, it raises your personal stature. Because there are some people who want their peerages, and they don't actually really do very much in the House of Lords. They can't be bothered with it. It's a lot of hard work. So what they do, but they enjoy the fact that they are a baroness or a baron, right? So it means they can become even more influential amongst their political tribes. You know, if David Frost had been like, if he'd have negotiated rather a trading cooperation agreement, then Boris Johnson at the end of it said, thanks very much, Frosty, off you go, go and sell whiskey again. He wouldn't be writing in the Telegraph these days. No, it's because Boris Johnson made him a lord. You know, there can even be ministers like David Frost and Zach Goldsmith, only intelligent. In a future Tory government, these people could actually become secretaries of state. They could become ministers, cabinet ministers, in a future government. Some of the people in the honours list really are not at all suitable. I mean, I would say that if the House were to be reformed rather than replaced, then at the very least appointments would have to come from certain fields. You'd have to be able to say, look, you need a background in reading and understanding legislation. And you would need to block, I think, certain fields. I would also say the appointments could not be made by the government. But even then, how do you reform it? How do you reform it without a clear out of some of the current members? And how do you do that without it being seen as party political? Because the ones needing clearing out would, after all, have been appointed by Conservative leaders. And the clear out would be by a Labour leader. It would look as dodgy as hell. And the reverse treatment would come if the Tories ever returned to power. Now, I think the entire concept has been blown apart. I think it's now impossible to argue that you can reform the system. I've certainly not seen anyone suggesting we reform it, come up with any sensible reforms that would work. Boris Johnson fatally weakened the system. He destroyed it. And Conservative MPs allowed him to. They just stood by. Scrap it, start it again with an elected chamber, a representative chamber. Because that's the other problem with the Lords, isn't it? Even when it is full of suitable members, so if it's full of people who know what they're doing, they're former ministers or at least very long-serving MPs, business leaders, trade unionists, lawyers, judges, you know, the sort of people that understand legislation will do that job. Yes, they've got their own political beliefs, but they know how to scrutinise legislation. Even when it's full of those sort of members, it's still full of people who live in or around London. That's no good. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. I hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. Until next time, I'll see you later.